Hi, folks. I'm Guy Malone. Happy to welcome you to my friend and I, Joe Jordan, and I's DVD filming today of a series of talks we've both done many times now here in Roswell and at other events. Our talks do tend to go a bit against the grain of what's more popularly believed about the UFO and alien phenomena, which we both believe is very real and worthy of study and investigation. Joe is, in fact, a certified MUFON, Mutual UFO Network investigator, and he's one of their national directors. He used to work for NASA, but he's currently working for a private military contractor in South Korea, and he'll be speaking later about his findings in the controversial field of abductions and contactees today. And he and I have both arrived at different conclusions than some others in this field, however, and it won't take you long today at all to realize why we're not exactly invited to speak downtown usually. But we did just, in fact, return from a nice breakfast event hosted by the UFO Museum this morning, which we were invited to. So it's worth saying that despite any differences of opinion or research findings, what you'll pick up today by being here, there isn't a hate relationship or anything of any kind like that going on. And my first talk today involves presenting information that I believe strongly argues against the famous flying saucer captured by the Roswell Army Airfield in July of 1947 was not the result of an alien craft from outer space crashing in the Roswell region. I'm boiling down and I'm introducing to you the research of myself and many other people based on findings that haven't been all that well known for most of the 70 plus years now, the period in question. And I'll bet you'll agree that this newer angle, though, it adds up to a very challenging interpretation of the events of July 1947. And the same information that I'm presenting will also lend itself to your understanding of why I certainly do not believe, however, that the Roswell incident was simply a weather balloon, as the Army Air Force stated in July 1947. In case you can't read that, the Roswell Daily Record reported the next day, after General Ramey emptied the famous Roswell saucer, the article reads, "General Ramey says disk is a weather balloon." An examination by the Army revealed last night that the mysterious objects found in a lonely New Mexico ranch was a harmless high-altitude weather balloon. That was the official story reported to the public that day, and it stood for nearly 50 years. The military, the government, would not comment on it any further, and a true veil of secrecy surrounded the event for decades. As you possibly know already, or could learn from almost anywhere in Roswell this weekend, people who were even slightly in the know were ordered not to speak of it, and some, including civilians, were threatened by government officials to keep their mouths shut. A local radio station was actually threatened by a phone call from Washington, D.C., that they would lose their FCC license if they aired an interview they recorded with Mac Brazel right afterwards. Mac Brazel being the rancher who originally found and called in the 1947 wreckage, and who stated in this Roswell Daily Record article that he'd previously found 2 other weather balloons, but that what he found this time did not in any way resemble them. That is in the news reports from the era right there. But in short, nobody really believed the weather balloon story, but they were really afraid to question it much further, at least until decades later anyways, which you know because that's why we're all here today. You may not know, however, that just over 20 years ago, and just in time for the city of Roswell's 50th anniversary of the incident in 1997, the United States Air Force came out with what is now known as the Project Mogul balloon explanation from their now utterly infamous 1997 Case Closed book. This was offered as their official final word on the Roswell incident. Basically, they admitted, in fact, that they were, in fact, lying about the original weather balloon story, and I won't take time to pick that one apart here, but most professional researchers at the time, 20 years ago, and since, who did pick apart the details of the claims from 1997, they didn't believe this one either. I will say, in complete agreement, I think, with all the researchers you'd have access to in Roswell this weekend, that both the 1947 and the 1997 official explanations offered by the U.S. government are full of holes enough to be classified as ridiculous fabrications. So of the three main arguments in the ufology field pertaining to what really happened here all those years ago, the alien hypothesis, the original weather balloon story, and the revised top secret mogul balloon story, if those were the only three possible explanations, I'd actually lean towards saying that the alien hypothesis is actually more believable than what the Air Force said in either 1947 or 1997. But now there's a fourth hypothesis that's on the table. It's been gaining a lot of ground in the last 15 years or so, among some researchers anyways, not so much in Hollywood, yet anyways, or with the mass media or even the general public. I'm one of many people out there presenting some version of this newer theory. Way back in 2002, I published my first version of this theory online at the domain roswellufocrash.com. And for a few years, it was surprisingly the #1 rank on Google for that search term. You can still use this URL to fact check me, whatever I present today. Read the text and review the slides that I'm using just from an older version of this talk when I first presented it publicly at the 2010 UFO Festival at the city's official conference, for that matter, on that talk, held at the next to the convention center. And I didn't get lynched then, by the way. I didn't get booed off stage for this either. This time last year, secular author Nick Redfern and I shared the Roswell Daily Record front page after presenting our alien skeptic presentations, it says. And that's a truly ingenious headline they came up with, I think, by the way. So again, all the images, though, all the quotes, all the documents, books, book links, everything I'm sharing with you today is online for you to check out yourself at roswellufocrash.com. Since 2002, in fact, when I first stumbled on this line of research, thanks to yet another popular UFO author, Dr. Michael Heiser, a PhD theologian who has also spoken here in town many times. And our lectures, it's not about nitpicking the details of what the other more well-known researchers and experts on Roswell will say about the incident. I'm not a debunker in any way. I always encourage people to hear out other points of view, but what I do is that I'm mainly sharing with you now a lot of newer and still today largely unknown details about what our government and our military in really highly compartmentalized ways, kind of like the Manhattan Project, of what they were in fact working on in 1947 that most people have never heard about. The facts that I think we all agree on are that in July 47, an unusual craft crashed in the desert of New Mexico. Number two, the Roswell Army Air Base was involved in recovering the craft and possibly bodies. The reported numbers have varied over the years from 1 to 5. And on July 8th, the Roswell newspaper covered a front page article, Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer on ranch at Roswell region. Following orders, the military recanted the flying disc press release hours later, claiming that the next day's paper, or claiming via the next day's paper, that it was just a weather balloon. And number 5, our government has been lying about it to us ever since. As an example of the ongoing lie, when the Air Force changed their story in 1997's official Roswell Case Closed report, when they introduced the mogul balloon story, they also added this completely unbelievable bit here about the literal crash test dummies being the explanation for the bodies that some people reported. Problem was, researchers immediately pointed out, I'm pretty sure Stanton Friedman gets the credit for documenting this first, that these dummies had not even been invented yet in 1947. And they certainly were not used by the Air Force for anything until 1953, which is so easy a fact to verify. It's led many to conclude that not only was the Air Force lying, again, in 1997's report, but they wanted people to be able to figure out that they were lying. Which is, what I'm positing here is that they are unofficially, even via the first press release from 1947, they want people to still think the incident was extraterrestrial to cover up some very ugly truths, starting with Operation Paperclip. This is an official United States government photograph from 1946. It's a group of 104 German scientists, Nazi scientists, who were moved here to the United States immediately following World War II. Yes, Nazi scientists were secretly moved into the United States. This is very well known now, but it wasn't known at all in the 1940s because it was actually kind of illegal that they were here. I'll get to that later. And therefore, the implications of these guys being here and why they were here was not known. But you could walk out of this room right now and just Google Operation Paperclip and start with the Wikipedia entry, and you'll actually talk yourself into this lecture's main conclusions in a real short amount of time. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page on Operation Paperclip, you click on that picture, you can hover over all their faces, mouse over them, and you'll get every one of their names. That's how well documented this is now. Okay, so they were all originally moved to Fort Bliss, Texas, where this picture was taken, and then some of them to White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico, and many of them were previously working on some very interesting advanced flying craft prototypes for Adolf Hitler in the closing years and the months of World War II. Among those pictured is Wernher von Braun. Many of you would probably know that name very well, especially if you're older than me. He went on to head NASA's rocket program and eventually became more or less an American celebrity back in the day. And historians, they'll now tell us that before von Braun and these others came to America, had Hitler gotten the working flying machines that they were all inventing at this time into mass production, photos of which I'll be showing you, before the Allies successfully invaded Germany, that the Allied forces would have lost World War II. Historians tell us that now based on what they know about the aircraft they were developing in Nazi Germany. But the earliest and perhaps definitive books on the subject is The Paperclip Conspiracy and Secret Agenda. This is Tom Bauer's book, The Paperclip Conspiracy, subtitled The Hunt for the Nazi Scientists, published in 1987. And that is long after the most famous books on the Roswell crash that we're familiar with now. That's way after they were published. The back cover on this reads, as the Allies moved into Germany, the full scale of Nazi research achievements burst upon them. They grabbed weapons, instruments, tools, files, and above all, scientists. There's also Linda Hunt's 1991 book, Secret Agenda, and in the opening pages she says, this book would not exist if it were not for the Freedom of Information Act. Because especially right before 9/11, a lot of now famous documents were released to the UFO research field via the Freedom of Information Act, simply on request. If you knew what to ask for and exactly how to ask, and what you were asking for was no longer classified, it was just the law that our government would release to you any files that they had on any subject. But Linda Hunt describes in the opening of her book that the government fought her so hard on the documents she was digging up, even though they were technically declassified and it was her legal right to go for them, they presented her with a bill for $239,000 in what they called search fees. You think they were trying to scare her off from completing her research for this book, maybe? But the gist here of all this, it has mostly to do that when the U.S. and Allied troops were invading all of Hitler's secret bases, they stumbled across such amazing technology that they wanted it. So these scientists were secretly brought into the United States under a media blackout program that paper-clipped fake bios on top of their Nazi crime dossiers because President Truman was personally, adamantly against putting certified Nazi criminals on the American payroll. Quote, Truman's order expressly excluded anyone found to have been a member of the Nazi Party and more than a nominal participant in its activities or an active supporter of Nazi militarism. Said restrictions would have rendered ineligible most of the scientists the JIOA, the precursor of the CIA, had identified for recruitment, and among them, Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, each earlier classified as a menace to the security of the Allied forces, bringing America's enemies right into our door. Truman had expressly ordered that no real practicing Nazis be brought into the U.S., but had that order been followed, even Wernher von Braun and other important scientists would have been excluded, and we can only speculate as to why, but von Braun's real dossier is still unavailable to the public today. But getting finally to the relevance of Roswell 1947, and again crediting Dr. Mike Heiser in his book The Facade for originally pointing me out in this direction, that in his book, referencing this line of thought briefly, was first published in the year 2000. So that's how long ago, at least, that this type of information has been out there and available for researchers to draw on and start putting the pieces together, like Mike apparently did before anybody else I personally know of. And right now I'm going to share with you a couple of articles, both of which went online November 2005. That they both went out the same day is kind of suspicious, I think, but both sum up all this very concisely. Project Paperclip, The Dark Side of the Moon. BBC, November 21, 2005. Thus began Project Paperclip, the U.S. operation which saw von Braun and more than 700 others spirited out of Germany from under the noses of the U.S.'s allies. Its aim was simple: to exploit German scientists for American research and to deny these intellectual resources to the Soviet Union. Some more excerpts from the article. 60 years ago, well now over 70 now, the U.S. hired Nazi scientists to lead pioneering projects such as the race to conquer space. These men provided the U.S. with cutting-edge technology which still leads the way today, but at a cost. The range of Germany's technical achievements astounded Allied scientific intelligence experts accompanying the invading forces in 1945. It was the U.S. and Soviet Union which, in the first days of the Cold War, found themselves in a race against time to uncover Hitler's scientific secrets. Thus began Project Paperclip, the U.S. operation, The article mentions some details on von Braun's associates also brought into the U.S. All of these men were cleared to work for the United States with their alleged crimes covered up and their backgrounds bleached by a military which saw winning the Cold War and not upholding justice as its first priority. Next, I'll show you this same BBC article includes a picture of what we now nonchalantly know of as the stealth bomber, but formerly one of our most highly classified crafts. But this article actually refers readers back to a World War II German craft, the 1944 Horten HO-229, as being, where it's underlined in red there, arguably the first stealth aircraft. Check it out, Horten HO-229, Germany, 1944, referred to in a 1970 book, Warplanes of the Third Reich, as the first flying wing to be powered by jet engines. Now, part of the popular mythology, I will dare say, associated with the Roswell incident is that the idea that our stealth aircraft, especially the B-2 bomber, was back-engineered from the Roswell 1947 crashed ship. I'll give you a book quote later. It is now finally known that that's not accurate. BBC actually refers to our B-2 stealth bomber as a modern clone of the Horten, and the caption under the photo reads, "The Stealth Bomber, based on a 1944 German design." The article speculates that the, quote, U.S. may have developed even more advanced Nazi technology, including anti-gravity devices, a potential source of vast amounts of free energy. With apologies to Stephen Greer, if that's anywhere near true. So I said that a huge part of the Roswell story, the alien crash version of the Roswell story anyways, is that this B-2 bomber and pretty much all of our stealth technology was reverse engineered from the Roswell crash. You might have heard that before. In some crowds, sharing this detail is actually bursting a bubble, but it's now extremely well known by historians and aircraft technicians anyways, not just popularly shared by Roswell UFO enthusiasts. The second article, November 16, 2005, suggests that what modern UFO advocates refer to as the truth embargo, to use Stephen Bassett's term, hung out with him a little bit this morning at the breakfast, or even Richard Dolan's phrase, the national security state, did not begin until in 1947, as you would naturally postulate. It's weird, but I'm actually saying that the real cover-up of the Roswell crash began in 1945. And I know that sounds very counterintuitive. How could one say that the 1947 crash cover-up began in 1945? Well, because facts, that's why. Listen to the first sentence of this article, front page of the New York Times on November 17th, 45, bore a curiously vague headline, 88 German scientists reach here, reputedly with top war secrets. Continuing, the scientists had arrived on a converted ocean liner the day before, were whisked away aboard a fleet of buses. Unusual precautions were taken to keep the arrival secret, and reporters who went on board the ship and found the 88 men waiting to land were warned away, is what the Times reported. The paper speculated that the group's arrival was the result of a program announced weeks earlier by the War Department to bring German scientists to America, and in spite of all the secrecy, the Times guessed right. Men who just 7 months earlier had been at war with the United States were being ushered onto our shores by the government. The purpose, to jumpstart American high-tech industry. The program's architects were sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. The article continues, these men and women were in essence spoils of war taken by the victor to benefit from the vanquished foe's history of scientific achievement. As Allied soldiers battled their way inland from Normandy, teams of technical intelligence gatherers followed in their wake. Their first real opportunity came after the liberation of Paris, when competition among the Allies, particularly the United States and USSR, but also Great Britain, France, Argentina, and Yugoslavia, heated up. Rivalries grew fierce in the following months as countries hid information from one another and scrambled to snag the best equipment and talent for themselves. By early the next year, 150 scientists were working across the country at locations like Wright Field in Ohio. Wright Field, Ohio. Anybody here know why that's significant? Yeah. If you know your Roswell story, Wright Field is where the wreckage from the 1947 crash was eventually taken. And this detail becomes very significant later. She continues in the article, the Dora concentration camp had supplied slave labor for the Nordhausen Missile Works, where prisoners had been fed a single piece of bread a day and literally worked to death by the thousands. 4 aviation doctors had suffocated gypsies in pressure chambers and force-fed Jews nothing but seawater for weeks. And this is what I underlined in the PowerPoint, to determine what pilots could withstand. See, back in the 1940s, Nazis were allowed to experiment on humans to determine what pilots could withstand. The scientists drew little attention from the American press or public until 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik. Suddenly, all eyes were on our rocket team. The assertion that their Germans are better than our Germans, variously attributed to Bob Hope, Lyndon Johnson, and some certain presidential advisors, that summed up the public's attitude at the beginning of our decade-long space race. But Paperclip left behind another darker legacy. The program's architects, post-1945, were sometimes willing to build on the results of often deadly Nazi research on captive human subjects. These experiments and Paperclip itself were among the first manifestations of what became a guiding principle of the Cold War, that the ends sometimes justified the means. Intelligence and government officials faced a delicate moral quandary in 1945, whether it was worth it to give American homes to men who had invented weapons to kill American soldiers, men who in some cases subscribed to the beliefs that hundreds of thousands of Americans had died to eradicate. In the day, they decided it was if these men could help the United States defeat the Soviets. So the author, Miss Gibson, lays out here beautifully the rationale for Operation Paperclip. The fact that these 2 separate articles came out in November 2005 kind of indicates that whoever controls the major presses these days is kind of just okay with the American people finding out about the Nazis working on U.S. soil, because these other books had already been published. But it didn't hit the press till 60 years after the fact, is my point. So you're beginning to understand now that under no circumstances could any of this that I've shared already be let out in 1947. Because what if you had just lost 2 sons fighting the Nazis? How would you react in 1947 to finding out that they're living in the United States now and eating quite well on your tax dollars? All that I just read introduces a topic I'll be getting back to later, that these Paperclip scientists were not only brilliant when it comes to technology, but they were both adept and willing to perform experiments on human test subjects, specifically to determine what pilots could withstand. Just warning you that the lecture will take a dark turn here in a little bit. But so fun stuff. Back to the Horton vehicle. Here's a few more pictures. Here's a modern recreation made for a film documentary. This 2009 National Geographic article documents the recreation of a Horton, noting, as many other sources state, the mass production of these things could have changed the course of the war. Wikipedia states that these jets exceeded 600 miles per hour, way faster than anything the U.S. had, and flew to almost 50,000 feet. That's the close-up from the article. And the last pictures, they're from a discussion thread. I can't tell you, some of them didn't quote their sources, but they're good shots. And I wish I could cite the source for that one. The poster didn't say anything about it. One of them earlier actually cited Northrop. And okay, we know Germany had these vehicles in prototype production prior to the end of World War II, which is a fact. You can do this research yourself and you'll find out you just can't dispute that anymore. But does that necessarily mean that the American military had them also? And what's all this got to do with Roswell, right? Here's some documentation from before the 2005 articles that hit the press. This is a January 1946 document I pulled years back from Mike Kaiser's website with a declassified stamp at the right. It originates from, of all places, looking at the top right underlining, Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. So again, the Wright Field connection where the Roswell debris wound up. I've added the text in red so you can read it from where you're sitting. It's unclassified now, but it is the actual cover page of a document that proves the U.S. Air Corps had a working knowledge of the German flying wings designed by the Horton brothers and was authorized to begin work on them here in the U.S. at Wright Field. Here's a picture of one being unloaded from a train in August 45 in the USA. The Wikipedia caption reads, "Unloading of captured Horton Ho XV-3 in the USA." The Wikipedia entry ends by saying, during the final stages of the war, the U.S. military initiated Operation Paperclip, an effort by various intelligence agencies to capture advanced German weapons research and to deny that research to advancing Soviet troops. A Horton glider and the HO-229B3, which was undergoing final assembly, were secured and sent to Northrop Corporation in the United States for evaluation. Northrop was chosen because of their experience with flying wings. So why is this finally important for our purposes today? Two major reasons. Number one, if you didn't work for the Northrop Corporation or for the United States military compartment that brought this aircraft over here from Germany in August 45, or if you weren't privy to Operation Paperclip in the mid-40s, you know, the clandestine operation being carried out specifically against the president's orders. So the number of people who knew about that had to be very, very small. But if you weren't in those categories, you didn't know that a craft of this type, or many others, even existed, much less had made it to the U.S. for R&D purposes. And this is important, number two, for this incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important reason. Anybody here know who this is? You're right, yes. His name's Kenneth Arnold, the pilot who in June 1947 said that he witnessed some amazingly fast ships over Mount Rainier in Washington state. You can watch a short YouTube interview with him, in fact, still. Important to note, he described their flight characteristics as skipping like a saucer. And as a result, in June 1947, the press first coined the phrase flying saucer based on pilot Kenneth Arnold's testimony, which is actually incorrect, as many researchers today point out. Ken Arnold said that it skipped like a saucer, not that it looked like a saucer. What he drew was obviously not saucer-shaped. Flying saucer is just the term the press coined. When did the press coin the term flying saucer? Just making sure I haven't put you to sleep yet, because the phrase flying saucer was coined by the press in June 1947. The Roswell Daily Record and others reported that a flying saucer captured on the ranch in Roswell region in July 1947, but the term was not based on a physical description of the craft. It was just the phrase that the American public already knew of, that had already been made popular by the press. And please keep your eye on the screen here real quick. I'm going to go through like 4 or 5 points. Now that we know that these guys, the Operation Paperclip Nazi scientists from Germany, were working on reproducing these types of craft, that's another Wikipedia image of the Horton, working on reproducing these crafts for American use, and that the paperclip scientists were spread across Fort Bliss, Texas, Wrightfield, Dayton, Ohio, and of all places, White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. Who here would now argue that what Kenneth Arnold described in 1947 was really from outer space? So there's some people that are really researched on the Roswell incident that they can agree, or they can back me up, that it will interest many of you to know that the craft recovered around the Roswell region in 1947 was not actually round or saucer shaped. That's what we have pictured in our head because of Hollywood or other renditions. And many will know that the main books on the Roswell incident that got everyone's attention were Crash at Corona, not Crash at Roswell, by the way. The wreckage was brought here, but the actual crash site is Corona, New Mexico. So it was brought to the Roswell Army Air Base. The Roswell Daily Record ran the headline that's famous around the world. That's why it's called the Roswell crash. But the Crash at Corona by Don Berliner and Stanton Friedman, who is, of course, speaking at the UFO Museum right now. Like I said earlier, darn my luck for planning this lecture slot months ago. I'm speaking when Stanton Friedman is here in town to retire. So, but the other book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt, these are the most famous books that have shaped our thinking on these topics. And Don Schmidt also speaks at the UFO Museum pretty much every year. And of course, he and Stanton Friedman proposed the extraterrestrial explanation. But the book, or their books shown here, are also the basis for the 1994 movie, Roswell, the UFO Cover-Up from 1994, which Randall and Schmidt are also credited as the writers of that movie. And I have in my possession some original drawings by a gentleman named Frank Kaufman, who served in the Roswell Army Air Base's 509th Bomb Squad in 1947, and he claimed to have been involved in the cleanup of the wreckage and the bodies. The images he drew is his alleged first-hand eyewitness testimony of what he cleaned up, or at least saw, and you can see that the version of the craft he drew is also not round, but more manta-shaped than circular. A very important note here is that the book UFO Crash at Roswell depends largely on Frank Kaufman's testimony, and also notes within the book in a caption under Don Schmidt's drawing based on Kaufman and other, very important, and other witnesses' testimony that the craft that crashed at Roswell was long and narrow. It was not a flying saucer. That is written in the original versions of these books. Years back, Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt have both stated that they no longer affirm Kaufman's complete testimony, if any of it, but the book and movie based on it it's still out there influencing people's views on the subject, and it has been for over 2 decades. You'd have to review their newest materials on their blogs, etc., and updated books to find out what's changed or what's been updated in their research. But of course, this is the only tiniest fraction of people who read the original books that are going to do that, or who remember the famous movie. Anybody would have any basis for knowing what the authors now feel from the original most popular editions is actually untrue or not valid or incorrect or whatever. So back to Kaufman's drawings of the craft he allegedly saw, published in the book 1947, I Was There by Robert Shirky. Shirky and Frank Kaufman worked together, by the way, in 1947, Kaufman being the artist and Shirky the writer. Keep in mind that the quote I gave you earlier, the Roswell crash was long and narrow, was based not only on Frank Kaufman's descriptions, though, but in conjunction with other eyewitnesses. So there's some inconsistency among the various witnesses, by the way, depending on how credible they're considered or on whether the Roswell crash ship was really round or more triangular or mantis-shaped. But it's also argued that since the idea for the B-2 bomber came from the Roswell crash, that kind of argues against the round or the disk hypothesis. and I've already submitted the 1944 Horton to you. But back on track, we do know for sure that the U.S. had scientists here working from German designs. While we do have real pictures of the Horton, here's yet another German prototype vehicle, the Lippisch P-13, that we only have sketches and models of because while the Nazis were starting to work on the prototype, the war ended before anyone can verify one of these was actually built. And then Operation Paperclip grabbed up all the existing sketches and prototypes and scientists they could relating to this craft. But here's a model by fantasticplanet.com of what one would have looked like had the Germans gotten one operational. It's rumored that they did get one, but it's not verified well enough for me to include any sources in here. But if built, it would have looked like this. So the very same German scientists who were designing, building, and testing both the Horton craft and arguably the Lippisch in late World War II were then brought to the U.S. in 1945 to top secretly design advanced aircraft for Americans. So what do you think? Just like the Ken Arnold flying saucer, are we looking here at an alien craft on the right or possibly a U.S.-based model based on German designs? Because it's either really amazing just how close those Germans got in World War II to designing ships that looked amazingly like extraterrestrial spacecraft that didn't get here until 1947, allegedly, or perhaps there is another explanation. Maybe the German scientists who designed the Horton and the Lippisch in 1944, given 2 years in U.S. secret labs with a blank check from Uncle Sam, maybe developed a spiffier model by July 1947. Maybe. I'm not claiming that I can document 100% exactly what happened, but as promised, I'm showing you a few things that you probably had no idea were true from the 1940s, and now I'm just kind of asking you, with this new knowledge, what do you really think happened in 1947? Did an alien ship really crash here and the government covered up? Or did a man-made ship designed by Nazis in U.S. secret bases crash here and the government covered it up? Or was it a balloon? Because those are the choices now. Okay, there's a part of me that really wishes I could sit down now and just let the defense rest, so to speak. And I've found over the years that about 3/4 of the people that go this far with me are actually pretty content to say mystery solved. But if I quit now, some people can bounce right back to the questions about the bodies and the fantastic metal found at the crash site, right? I did. So I'll be getting to those details. Just keep in mind, I've introduced the topic of human experimentation by Nazi war criminals on American citizens to this whole discussion already for reasons. This actually only gets worse from here. If you want to argue that the recovered Roswell craft was round, there is a whole stream of research regarding other more advanced models that just weren't similar to the stealth fighters. There's not time to give you an exhaustive look at some of these things. Actual photos are quite rare. But a few books you might want to be aware of: Man-Made UFOs and Hitler's Flying Saucers. Those are photos, by the way. The author of this book appears in the History Channel video I'm going to play for you here. But for the sake of time, I cut a few quotes and other book references. There's a few others you can look to continue this line of thought. Joseph Farrell is very good, by the way. The article I quoted earlier mentions that some of the Nazi scientists were taken to South America in addition to Russia and the U.S. Farrell thinks the Roswell crash actually originated from Argentina, but it was the same man-made technology nonetheless. The point is merely presenting that I think there are valid arguments that the craft recovered in 1947 didn't come from outer space, and others are arguing different versions of this. It's not me by any means only. So before moving on, I've concentrated mainly on the Horton model and its resemblance to the Ken Arnold sightings that made flying saucers a buzzword in the United States media 1 month before July 1947. Remember, so much of the furor and the hoopla surrounding the immediate global response to the 1947 Roswell Daily Record article was precisely because everybody already knew at the time that advanced airships were being seen across the United States and reported on nationally. So the scoop of the century truly came when the Roswell Daily Record headline read, "Roswell Army Airfield Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region." The fact that there was now one on the ground being examined by our own incredibly heroic and immensely trustworthy government, and that perhaps Americans could now finally know the truth and find out what these things were, it was packed with promise and excitement. But we all know that didn't happen. So if the line of reasoning I'm proposing has any resemblance to the truth, perhaps now we're beginning to see why. Possible aliens is not the only thing worth maybe covering up. I've demonstrated, and our government already was covering up, that these scientists were here. We were trying to beat the Russians to developing the advanced technology too. So we had other secrets to keep as well. If there's any Nazi or Operation Paperclip connection to the Roswell incident, I don't think that 1940s American society really wanted to know that we had over 100 Nazis living here on secret bases working for us, even though now we had to defend our new title of undisputed world champion superpower. The president and the top military brass sure as heck weren't going to own up to Operation Paperclip at the time either, especially that the president's explicit orders were disobeyed and circumvented by what would become known as CIA. So I just suggest that the moral outrage of the fact that all this getting out in the 1940s, it would have been at least as bad or divisive to our country as the Vietnam War was decades later. And if what I'm guessing here is correct, I'd ask you also to think for a minute on whether the U.S. government was actually right in covering it up. It's of course highly debatable still whether we should have even brought these guys into the country, the paperclip scientists. But after World War II, we had the Cold War. All the evidence suggests that the Soviet Union and at least half a dozen other countries were recruiting these scientists and taking them and their technology into their borders. So where would we be today if we had not done the same? It's a tough call, no matter how you look at it. I'm just trying to look inside the heads of the people who would have made these decisions for us back then. Okay, before rounding third, it can take 3 minutes to watch this History Channel program clip, just so you can see designs of other than what I've shown you, and hear this from just another source even. This was previously free viewing on history.com, searching real Nazi UFOs, and maybe you can still buy the whole documentary.
The story of the real UFOs begins in Nazi Germany. As victory in the Second World War was slipping from their grasp, German scientists were trying to perfect weapons that might turn the war in Hitler's favor. One of these was Victor Schauberger, an inventor who had produced models for a flying saucer. It had met the promise of a flying machine that could maneuver like a helicopter, but travel at supersonic speed undetected by the enemy. Schauberger's craft utilized a tornado-like vortex, which produced magnetic effects causing levitation.
The Germans had, in fact, gone far enough into development and testing that aircraft were in the air. And one company, Messerschmitt, and had flown a complete saucer-shaped aircraft.
These pictures of the early prototypes resemble photographs of UFOs that would emerge in the coming decades. But this was not the world of science fiction. These were highly advanced UFOs. This deadly development in warfare technology was to start a whole new era of military aviation history. The use of flying saucer technology to produce even more efficient killing machines was to be the culmination of this research.
During the Nazi period, we had a flowering of new thought, of scientific thought, of technological development.
So, okay, while I don't want to undermine a premise that I myself just put out and maybe even convinced you of, to end this portion here's a fairly balanced thought with you from the Burlington News article on Hitler's UFOs. It says, however, exactly what was being developed is now less a matter of historical record and more of a historical jigsaw, with not only pieces missing, but other pieces conceived in the minds of writers who then peddled fictitious Nazi flying saucer myths to those who chose to believe them. Establishing fact from fiction from over 50 years ago is no easy matter. We are forced to consider information that is largely unverifiable, yet when pieced together, a plausible story of Nazi flying disc technology does begin to emerge. So just closing out the UFO portion of this talk, the Nazi UFO, Now we know the true facts are, in 1940 to 45, Nazi scientists were aggressively developing amazing flying machines. In 1945, the U.S. moved them to Texas and White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico. In 1947, an unidentified flying object crashes in the New Mexico desert, and the military enforces the greatest cover-up of any event ever discovered by the general public. So with this new information in your head, perhaps for the first time for many of you, my question really is, where do you think the craft recovered in 1947 most likely came from? Mars, Alpha Centauri, the Pleiadian star system? Switching gears, the obvious question to some should become, though, yeah, Guy, but what about the bodies? And I'll apologize again in advance because I know this is going to offend some people, I think. That's not my intent, but getting to the truth was. And I just let the research take me where it would. I briefly just introduced the ugly fact that human experimentation was part of what the Nazi scientists were guilty of before they came here. Linked from my website, there's an article on the George Washington University's National Security Archives page that documents the human experimentation continued afterwards on U.S. soil. Just a plain text document that matter-of-factly discusses the paperclip scientists as well as the radiation experiments they conducted in the United States after they were here at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in the United States after they were here. It's addressed to members of the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. Reads in part, the Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine, SAM, at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas conducted dozens of human radiation experiments during the Cold War, among them flash blindedness in studies connected with atomic weapons tests and data gathering for total body irradiation, studies conducted in Houston. And the experiments for which Nazi investigators were tried included many related to aviation research. These were mainly high-altitude exposure studies, oxygen deprivation experiments, and cold studies related to air-sea rescue operations. The information about aircrew hazards was important to both sides. It continues elsewhere by saying that a number of military research sites recruited paperclip scientists with backgrounds in aeromedicine and radiobiology. The portfolio of experiments in the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine included total body irradiation, space medicine, flash blindedness studies. The Air Force Surgeon General and SAM officials welcomed the paperclip scientists. In March 1951, folks, this human experimentation was a matter of routine 4 years after the Roswell incident. To quote, to seek more first-class scientists and highly qualified technicians from Germany welcomed the paperclip scientists, it said. This document is still online at gwu.edu. I just checked this week. And this is sad. In some effect, it's damning, but a sad but true part of American history is that our government has at many times experimented on humans without their knowledge or consent. There are many lists of such acts online. From rents.com, posted in 2003, all of it is easily verifiable. 1931 injects human subjects with cancer cells and exposes American soldiers and civilian hospital patients to radiation. 1932, 200 black men are diagnosed with but never told they have syphilis, just so we could study the disease. 1935, we allow a curable disease to wipe out portions of poverty-ridden black populations. 1943, U.S. begins research on biological weapons. 44, U.S. Navy uses human subjects to test gas masks by locking them inside a gas chamber filled with mustard gas. 45, Operation Paperclip. 46, hospital patients used as human guinea pigs for medical experiments. 47, Atomic Energy Commission begins administering intravenous doses of radiation to human subjects. 47, LSD tested on both military and civilians without their knowledge. So you may find all this hard to believe, but as recently as 1997, Senator and former astronaut John Glenn submitted a bill to Congress to only finally protect Americans from being research subjects without our consent. Addressing Congress, he said, "I began to question what protections are in place to prevent such abuses from happening again. What law prohibits experimenting on people without their informed consent? What I found when I looked into it is there is no law on the books requiring that informed consent be obtained. I believe there is need for such a law. I find it astounding," he continues, "that even after Nuremberg, we still don't have a law on our books requiring that informed consent be obtained prior to conducting research on human beings. Finally, Mr. President, my legislation would." 1997, John Glenn is recommending legislation that you and I have to be informed of any time the government, or some corporation even, wants to experiment on us. This should be shocking to you, but it's a cold hard fact that the U.S. government, and frankly anybody, had carte blanche to experiment on humans without their knowledge or consent because of some serious loopholes in the legal system that Senator Glenn pointed out in this speech. And that definitely includes the early days of the Cold War era, and the period between 1945 and July 1947. So, relating to Roswell, once you're not afraid to go where I don't think many Americans in 1947 would have even dreamed was possible, there's definitely a few possible explanations for the reported bodies that have arisen. The most well-documented, which I'll share with you in just a moment, was proposed by well-known UFO researcher Nick Redfern in his 2005 book, Body Snatchers in the Desert: The Horrible Truth at the Heart of the Roswell Story. Now, I didn't know Nick well when I was writing my theory in 2002, much less that he was following some leads and himself working on a book about a man-made explanation of the Roswell Incident. But on my site, I put forth a total shot-in-the-dark hypothesis about the bodies. And that being 2002, I don't remember exactly today what inspired me to do this, but I was aware somewhat that human experimentation occurred in the past, and also that institutionalized people, those who wouldn't be readily missed, were sometimes targets. I simply went to Google, and based on what some prominent Roswell witnesses, storytellers, whatever you want to say, claimed, I typed in symptoms: large bald head, big eyes. And I learned for the first time about progeria. And as I wrote on the webpage then, I hope I've never been more wrong in my life. Children with progeria usually have these features: dwarf bald head, pinched nose, large head with small face, prominent eyes. Results in rapid aging of children. In disproportionately small bodies given the size of their heads. The children are thin with baldness. Among the first symptoms are hair loss, diminished growth. The head is disproportionately large and bald. But all the math was kind of adding up. Nazis on U.S. soil, known for human experimentation, experimental craft, and a Cold War to win. Progeria victims was just the original line of thinking I posted in 2002 as a possible explanation for the bodies. Nick Redfern and Mike Heiser have both likewise postulated that the people in the crashed ship could have been other human unfortunates like POWs or radiation victims. By the way, when Nick reviewed my site in 2002 at my request, I posted his reply. Largely, I was very honored to have a positive review from someone of his stature, which reads, "I would agree with you that the possibility of the Roswell bodies were human is a very real one, and one that is regrettably very few researchers are looking into. The only problem I have with the progeria hypothesis is that progeria is extremely rare. Would the Nazis or U.S. have been able to acquire 5 people with progeria of similar appearances and similar height, all in 1947? Good question. Very fair. But apparently Nick looked into it a little more, and it turns out that the last chapter of his book is actually titled Progeria Now, where he documents that likelihood beyond my initial guesswork. I'll read from Dr. Michael Heiser's summary and review of Nick's book in a moment. But first, just to get Mike Heiser back in the picture, because he's the one that got me started on the paperclip trail. Although, honestly, I think I got him started on the progeria trail. This is from his website, Mike Heiser's, which started by saying, "The view taken in the facade is that the Roswell crash of July 2, 1947 was in fact a paperclip accident." That is an actual government archive picture he posts, by the way, but from a later date, not 1947. Reading from the second half, Mike writes, "The facade argues that the object recovered at Roswell was an experimental craft modeled after flying discs designed during World War II by Nazi engineers under Operation Paperclip. The designs and the know-how were exported to the U.S. via some of the Nazi technicians who had begun the project in Germany. There was therefore some sort of connection between Majestic 12 and Paperclip. The facade further argues that the bodies recovered at the crash were human unfortunates, Mongoloids, Asians, progeria victims, etc., deemed worthy of the kind of human experimentation required for testing high-altitude craft." I'm going to have to skip reading from Mike's excellent summary of Nick's book. I'm going to run through these PowerPoints real quickly just for those who want to freeze them on DVD. Mike, from his page, was my source for the 1947 report cover I showed earlier on the Horton Brothers craft being known by the Army Air Corps in '46. The same document also appears in Nick Redfern's book, in which he goes into some more amazing documentation regarding the connection between radiation experiments done on humans and especially prisoners of war. And then he also builds the paper trail, finally, that leads to the Roswell incident. Just as a related addendum, a later email that Nick Redfern sent to me, especially if you live here, this is interesting. "RE, the whole Japanese angle. Several people have said to me, old-timers, have said that part of the secret of where the people came from is a place called Fort Stanton. Do a Google search on Fort Stanton, New Mexico, and take a good look at its history, which includes keeping both handicapped people there and Japanese people during the war. And it's just down the road in aviation terms from where the debris was found in Lincoln County at the ranch. Fort Stanton has a curious and intriguing history, which definitely deserves looking at deeper." Nick did look deeper, by the way. You should read his books on the Roswell crash sometime. He published a sequel to Body Snatchers last year. Now, Mike ends with a very fair assessment of Stanton Friedman's review of Nick's book, which you can probably guess was less than favorable. Mike charitably points out that it's fair that someone like Stanton Friedman, who's invested so many years of his life into promoting one view, would indeed need a little more documentation than Nick provided to completely overturn Friedman's alien view, of course. But what about you? Here in person or on DVD, on video, on YouTube, not everybody is as ardent in their belief that aliens crashed here as Stanton Friedman is, or Don Schmitt either. And quite honestly, I consider my target audience for this talk the undecided category. Not so much the true believers, or especially the people who make their living from proving the alien view. I think it's a cinch that the craft can be argued as an Earth-made vehicle, but let me read to you in Nick's words some documentation regarding the types of humans in general who were in fact being experimented on literally in 1947 by the Roswell government, or by the U.S. government. Reading just one paragraph from Nick's Progeria chapter, citing the November 1947 Biology Division Bulletin. "One other critical piece of evidence officially links such conditions as progeria and dwarfism with the activities of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and elsewhere in the summer of 1947. More specifically, the report focused on the results of a whole range of radiation-related experiments undertaken in mid-1947 on no fewer than 54 test subjects, of whom 15 were between 1 and 4 years of age. 7 were controls, 2 were classic cretins, 1 showed some features of hypothyroidism, which was not modified by treatment, 2 were dwarfs, in 1 the diagnosis was gargoyleism, 1 was suspected of progeria, a disorder associated with some of the features of hypothyroidism, and the last exhibited features of moderate sexual precocity. 27 were more than 4, but less than 15 years of age. Of these, 2 had unmistakable hypothyroidism, Graves' disease, and 4 were dwarves. November 3, 1947. issue of Biology Division Bulletin of the Clinton National Laboratory. Now, I'm not asking if you 100% believe Nick's hypothesis about some of those kids playing into the Roswell incident, or my original progeria hypothesis that was postulated before Nick introduced radiation testing on human subjects for experimental nuclear-powered ships that were so new they needed balloons attached to help them fly, as Mike's earlier picture also suggests. I'm not asking if you believe Mike's hypothesis completely either. All I'm asking is, do you now believe that there could be a or any terrestrial earthly explanations for the bodies that were reportedly found in 1947? Because, and I'm really about to stir the pot a bit by saying that the only images you've probably ever been exposed to of the Roswell bodies were based on something drawn third hand in 1991, 44 years after this alleged meeting occurred between Glenn Dennis and a mystery woman. At the time of the writing of the above affidavit, artist Walter Henn drew the following sketches under the direction of Glenn Dennis. These sketches are to depict the drawing allegedly made for Dennis by the nurse. So this 1989 drawing accompanies Glenn Dennis's 1991 affidavit of his participation in the Roswell incident. His story is also a huge part of why we're all here today, every year, because Glenn Dennis is one of the original founders of the Roswell UFO Museum, in case you didn't know that. And his story is a bedrock part of the foundation for how the story of the Roswell incident has always been told. He's the mortician who was called, and I totally believe this part, he was called by the Army Air Base to provide for them child-sized caskets after they arrived back in town with the wreckage from the incident. But as it relates to this drawing, he added some details to his story, which many have publicly disputed. He says he later had a meeting with a nurse from the Army Air Base who was very troubled about what she'd seen and drew him a picture of the bodies she'd supposedly seen. So, at age 65, he is remembering what he claims an unidentified nurse at the Army Air Base drew for him, a nurse no Roswell researcher has ever been able to verify existed, and frankly, most now say he just made up. Google that yourself and see the verdict on what the credible paid Roswell researchers, even the authors I'm referring you to today, all say these days, 25 years later, after all these books were first released, about the Roswell nurse. Naomi Self was a name of, I believe, two Glenn Dennis provided. An artist, Walter Henn, drew these sketches for him based on what Glenn Dennis said he remembered in 1989 of this unidentified nurse's 1947 sketch, which he said he lost. Wikipedia says Dennis's accounts featured prominently in Crash at Corona, published in 1992, and the 1992 The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, published in 1994, as well as other pro-UFO books, but serious doubts about his story were soon raised. For some, like Carl Flock and Kevin Randall, these inconsistencies were great enough to discount Dennis's credibility entirely. Researchers who investigated Dennis's claims found a number of inconsistencies. Another one, the sketches Dennis supplied to Friedman in 1989 were discovered to have a questionable history. Dennis had not drawn them. As he claimed, he asked another artist, Walter Henn, to do them. Henn said he had been approached by Dennis, who needed to supply a UFO researcher with some drawings he claimed the nurse had done. Henn claimed Dennis said, "We could make a lot of money out of this." Page 136. Drawn third hand, 42 years later, that singular, debatable image is the major source of almost all Roswell bodies, stories, and movies and drawings that you've most likely ever seen. This drawing is the source for what the bodies looked like in the two most popular best-selling books on Roswell written, and almost everything you think you know about the bodies came from this testimony. But is this testimony credible? I'll also submit to you now for your considerations the drawings of Frank Kaufman, whom I introduced earlier as part of the 509th Army Air Base, that handled and cleaned up the Roswell crash debris and possible bodies, although I'll admit there's no way of telling how much of his testimony can be believed either, unfortunately. This is what Frank Kaufman drew to describe the bodies he claimed to have personally witnessed. This is not a third-hand drawing, but first-hand. Kaufman attended art school, by the way, and after he died, Frank Kaufman's overall testimony itself has finally been deemed unreliable by Kevin Randall, who, along with Don Schmidt, at some point after the publication of their books, distanced themselves from his version of events. I just say all this to remind you that every drawing of the Roswell bodies and the ship you've likely been exposed to is based on testimony that the researchers who originally published the drawings and wrote the books now dispute as inauthentic. America and the whole world, I think, is under a mistaken notion that I think I can fairly and accurately describe as a modern mythology. Now, these images don't look particularly alien, I'd submit to you, but I also submit that no drawings of the alleged bodies are considered reliable by any majority of any published Roswell researchers. All we know is that they're pretty universally said to have large heads, big eyes, and child-sized bodies. Something like this one, I'm afraid. I'm not going to cue this video, by the way, don't worry. The resemblance is so eerie, you might say, that there's actually a 1986 movie with the progeria kid actor playing a spaceman. So knowing that high altitude and radiation tests were among the exact human experimentation tests being run all throughout the 1940s, and that disfigured and so-called undesirables were among the favorite victims of the experimentors, with what you know today about what different world governments have done in the name of science and research, including employing Nazi scientists to carry out all the dirty work, I'm simply posing the question, would you put it past them to put someone like this into an experimental craft, perhaps remote controlled, just to see what the effects on the human body would be of perhaps never before achieved altitudes, speeds, and nuclear-powered vehicles, as these other authors have already posited, or radiation in the upper atmosphere that we didn't know about in the 40s, but we do now? Or would you put it past our government now or then to use someone like this to find out how much radiation a human body could safely absorb, assuming they're flying a craft with a brand new, untested nuclear-powered engine? When I said flying, probably remote-controlled, because you don't want to always risk losing Chuck Yeager on your earliest experimental prototype vehicles, right? We all know that you start with dogs, chimpanzees, and you work your way up. And I know, I'm sorry, this is supposed to be a festival. This line of thinking is not very festive, I realize. So is aliens the only possible explanation for any dead or dying bodies that might have been found at the 47 crash site? I'm sorry and kind of sick to my stomach to have to report to you that the answer is a resounding no. There was a Cold War going on, and apparently both sides felt that it had to be won at any cost. I don't ask you to buy into any one particular line of reasoning 100%. I'm just asking you to answer for yourself. Now that you know what people in 1947 and even in 1997 after the main books on the Roswell crash had been published and widely circulated for many years, now that you know what absolutely nobody was allowed to know back then, you now know that the crash ship itself doesn't require a leap to alien spacecraft anymore. So I just ask you to consider, do the reports of odd bodies require an alien explanation? And heck, if you'd never heard of progeria or hyperthyroidism, and you saw a human body that looked like this in a weird crash ship out in the desert, might you even think it was alien? All right, I'll get to lighten things up a bit and close this out. The memory metal, as you may have heard by now, that the crashed Roswell ship was made of, or partly made of at least, was described as being very tough, but if crumpled or bent would go back to its original shape. There was absolutely nothing like that was known to exist at the time, though, right? Right? There is much talk about all the marvels that were allegedly back-engineered from the Roswell crash, like the stealth bombers, for instance, but we know that was not the case. The top secret file of Roswell information came into my possession when I took over the foreign technology desk at R&D Today, items such as lasers, integrated circuitry, fiber optic networks, accelerated particle beam devices, and even Kevlar material in bulletproof vests are all commonplace. Yet the seeds for the development of all of them was found in the crash of the alien craft at Roswell and turned up in my files 14 years later. It was alien technology that we used: lasers, accelerated particle beam weapons, and aircraft equipped with stealth features. And to be clear first, I am not saying that Colonel Corso was lying. I believe that he believed what he was telling in his very famous book was true to the best of his knowledge. But whoever told him that our stealth technology was back-engineered from an alien craft, or whoever told the person above him, was lying. Fact, you know that now. You know something today that a retired Army colonel who was put in charge of the Roswell wreckage didn't know when he published his testimony in 1997. Stealth technology was invented prior to Roswell by Germans, which makes it really easy to believe that whoever created these famous files and the filing cabinet that Colonel Corso was put in charge of was probably lying to him. But why would someone in the government do that to our own military or to the people working right under them? Colonel Corso actually suggests an answer for this very question himself in paragraph 3 of the introduction to this book, telling us that even before his involvement with the Roswell files, he knew a terrible secret that, quote, some of our government's most revered institutions had been penetrated by the KGB. Colonel Corso himself testified to this in 1962, he says, and he made a personal effort to get that information to President Kennedy through his brother. And in fact, Tom Bauer and Linda Hunt both point out in their books from the beginning of this presentation on Operation Paperclip that Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Whalen, who was running Operation Paperclip, was convicted in 1962 of selling American defense secrets to the Soviet Union. Whalen is the highest-ranking American military officer to have ever been convicted of espionage. In fact, the guy that ran Paperclip in 1962. So here's how intelligence and counterintelligence sometimes works. And when you suspect you have moles, the CIA or top military officials, they're trying to figure out who to go after, how do we close this leak. You give one person some top secret intelligence, data, or experimental technology, and you tell them it's of Russian origin smuggled out by one of our own spies. You give someone else the same tech and tell them it's created from Tesla technology. You tell someone else it's from an extraterrestrial craft, for instance. You tell someone else that Westinghouse or GE invented it and the government seized it and or bought it from them under the military application law. None of these stories have to be true, but you create the documentation and give it to 4 different people, then you wait to see which fabrication makes its way to the Soviets. And then guess what? You know who your mole is. So like I said, I don't believe Colonel Corso was lying in his famous testimony, but I think he was repeating a lie he'd been told that he still believed, because the true backstory of the B-2 bomber is all we need to know that the Roswell wreckage did not lead to that particular technology, as he claimed in his book. Well, there's also a memory metal out there today that's called nitinol that's also argued by some to have been developed in the immediate aftermath of the Roswell crash, as this website and many others argue. Let's first take a quick look at what nitinol today does when bent out of shape.
A bunch of scrumpled wire in a dish, but this is no ordinary wire. This is nitinol metal, which remembers a predetermined shape, and you can get back to that shape simply by pouring warmish to gently hot water, I would call this, over the piece, and see what happens. Goodness me. And there has the word, oh, turn it over, hot. Oh, that's nicely done. And then you can take it out, cool it down, and scrumple it up again. And for many, many hundreds of times, it will restore itself to HOT for hot from a crumpled state. Remarkable product, nitinol wire.
The metal you've just seen requires a temperature change to get back to its original shape, but that's not the way the Roswell witnesses describe it happening. So that can't really be it, obviously. But starting again, good old Wikipedia. Nitinol alloys exhibit shape memory and super elasticity. Shape memory refers to recovering the metal's original undeformed shape upon heating. Super elasticity, however, occurs at narrow temperature range, and, get this, no heating is necessary to cause the undeformed shape to recover. Wow, that describes what Jesse Marcel says he found. So we ask, exactly how long has this stuff been around? Well, nitinol by that name was more or less discovered during research in 1962 and not developed, that we know of, until a decade later. But the history of memory metal in general dates back, calling your attention to the red highlighted text, to 1932, according to this same Wikipedia page on nitinol. I checked that this week also, and the page looks very different now, but the 1932 date still stands. So this source says that these properties were first observed in 1938, but also says no serious research advances were made until the 1960s. And again, I would suggest none that we know of. But hopefully you can see already, if we had aircraft flying around the U.S. that the general military, much less the general public, had no clue existed, how much of a stretch is it to wonder that memory metals, first discovered in the 1930s, might be making it into experimental craft of the late 1940s? Breaking news. In only May 2009, well-known UFO reporter Billy Cox publishes an article revealing that the files relating to the history of memory metals development in the 1940s are now missing. Surprise! Files from the 1940s missing. Imagine that. But the files on memory metal origins and the history of development are missing from both the U.S. Air Force Base and the Battelle Institute, both of which he notes should have them, and that a General Craigie, who had an office at Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio in 1947, where the Roswell debris finally wound up, made a hurried flight to Roswell during the UFO controversy. So I forwarded this article to Mike Kaiser. He does some research and blogs. Mike notes, get this, that Billy Cox notes that nitinol can also be linked to the Oak Ridge Laboratory, a place that plays a key role in Nick Redfern's book. Nitinol at that lab, too. Nick Redfern's book about the radiation experiments on humans exposed. And Mike adds that perhaps General Craigie went to Roswell because he knew of a highly classified project involving a craft that employed the use of nitinol, a metal that had the properties described by Colonel Marcel. When Craigie heard the reports and did the math, he knew that the project had to be kept under wraps and attention diverted. So keeping in mind the 1946 document, which originated in Wright Field, Ohio, detailing the use of Horton technology, the obvious question that has to be posed is the reason that the Roswell crash and debris was taken to Wright Field, Ohio in the first place, simply because that's where the top Army brass who knew the whole picture actually worked out of. Is it possible General Craigie just wanted his nitinol back? Or even, was the 1947 debris taken to Wright Field, Ohio, because that's where some of the Nazi scientists were, as we already know? And as the Christina Gibson article detailed, it's actually starting to sound like all of the above. The metal from 1947 Roswell incident was reported by Jesse Marcel, Sr. and Jr. to be unlike anything known at the time, which usually leads to the explanation, well then it must be from outer space. But perhaps that's a further leap in logic than is actually necessary, knowing now that memory metals were first discovered in the 30s. So to finally close this out, in 1947, of course, the general public and 99% of the military knew absolutely nothing about the exotic flying craft the Germans had invented or that the American government had in our possession and was working to replicate and to improve upon before the Russians did it and came over here and to wipe us off the map. Especially in 1947, American citizens would not have believed or even wanted to know that our own government was even remotely capable of fatally experimenting on its own citizens for any reason. The possibility of such well-documented, now, atrocities didn't even enter their minds. Of course it wouldn't. We were the good guys, remember? But if you did find out about any of this, any of these things, even on accident, like you weren't supposed to know, might you be threatened with death if you were to speak of them? You bet you would have. These were our top secrets at the time, and some of it was being done illegally behind the back of a sitting president without the consent or knowledge of the so-called top brass or Congress. So when the Roswell incident happened in 1947, none of what I shared with you today was even remotely within the realm of possibility to consider when faced with the facts that the 1947 witnesses had at hand. None of this. All people knew for 50 years was that an exotic ship made of an unheard of type of metal with strange bodies crashed in the desert, and the government enforced a cover-up of never before heard of proportions. You need to know the polls from the 40s and 50s, unlike today, show that not even 1 in 10 people believed life on other planets existed, though, much less could be visiting Earth, like 3/4 plus believe today, according to polls. So, I want to be real fair here. I sincerely believe it took some pretty courageous people thinking really outside the box to even go on record as saying that the Roswell wreckage might have been from another world. Anybody willing to think outside the box on this event for even the first 50 years of the cover-up has always done so at the risk and personal expense of extensive ridicule, especially from peers and family. The witnesses who have come forward over the decades and the researchers who have affiliated their good names with these stories, I seriously say are to be commended for their courage in many cases, I'd say. And yeah, I do mean the legitimate pro-alien view researchers that I've mentioned today. Even if I disagree with their conclusions based on the information I've shared, it doesn't mean they're evil or purposely scamming people. It just means that their research leads them to conclusions that differ from mine. All it means is that one or both views are wrong. Maybe it really was a Project Mogul balloon. I'm suggesting, though, that this proverbial box that people have been thinking outside of is today a lot larger than we ever previously could have thought about. So do we have to go outside of the box today anymore to account for all of the reported details of the Roswell incident? I want you to consider here, if everything we've discussed today was public knowledge in 1947, and the news got out that our government recovered a crashed saucer in New Mexico and covered it up for some reason, let's imagine what people might have thought then, if all we've learned today was public knowledge 71 years ago. Perhaps something more like, oh, it's probably just another one of them stealthy Horton Lippish spinoff thingies they've been working on over in White Sands to help fight the commies. Hope nobody got hurt. Seriously, what kind of legs do you think the alien theory would have gotten over the last 70 years if the average American knew about Operation Paperclip or the Fantastic Flying Machines in 47? Because the main strength behind the extraterrestrial hypothesis relating to the 1947 incident has, quite frankly, nothing resembling any proof of extraterrestrial activity. It never has. The strongest and the only argument for the alien view has always been that there's just simply no other explanation for the reported facts and the credible witnesses. Well, as you now know, there are other facts. You really can believe most of the witnesses to the 1947 incident, those who stood the test of time and the scrutiny of multiple professional researchers, without thinking they're crazy, without thinking they're lying, and also without believing that aliens crashed here in 1947. But without some actual evidence, or at least a much stronger case for an alien explanation of 1947, I'm going to have to say that the people who do believe in aliens have fallen into a stronghold, and that their view is actually faith-based. There's usually two sides or more to any story, and if you've only ever considered an issue from one hypothesis without knowing about more of the available evidence or possibilities, you never can really arrive at truth. You may think you have because you have a piece that's definitely true. And when it comes to the alien view of Roswell, I know some are pretty adamant about looking at it from only one angle. They're absolutely dogmatically certain of a view they can't even really prove, for which they have no actual evidence to support their conclusions, which is actually the definition of religion, in case you hadn't put that together yet. I'm not going to harp on that right now, but my next talk today actually does extensively get into what forces are actively shaping people's religious beliefs worldwide through faked alien contacts. Even though it's a more religious talk in nature, You'll see my same style of extensive documentation of my arguments, like it or not. So if you like what you heard already, I hope you'll be back. The only thing I have left to answer is a question that I'm asked so frequently when I do this talk. I was asked specifically this last year at the bigger presentation, and I've actually created this one final slide to address it. I get asked that since my site has been online for over 15 years, and I do this talk in Roswell, right when all the other guys are in town doing their alien talks, people have asked me, what kind of feedback do I get from the more famous authors and researchers that are in town this time of year, without naming names, just like the ones who are speaking at the UFO Museum, or even the people working at the UFO Museum. And I usually just give a little polite answer. It's like, well, they just kind of ignore me, honestly, which is true, but it is also not the whole truth. I ran across this a while back and just had to hold on to it for today's recording. So I'm probably going to let that slide answer that question for me from now on. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Thanks for your time.